Okay, I think we're ready to start.
Okay.
Hi, welcome to another episode of a grown-ups Fireside Storytime chat hosted by the Sheboygan County Historical Society and Museum. My name is Angie. I'm the Education Program Developer at the museum, and these are my helpers, Adley and his pal Blue Jay, and my son Jory and his pal Tricky. In our most recent episode of the Children's Fireside Storytime chat, episode 6, we read from the book Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod and Other Bedtime Lullabies. And for the last 6 episodes of the Fireside Chat, I've been reading books that we have just had in our house because it's what we had available to us. And this is one of those books that I don't know where we got it or why it's in our house. If my life were a novel, this would probably be one of those mysterious objects that shows up and you don't really know where it came from. Maybe it was placed there by a trickster or divine intervention. The reality is probably much more mundane. I probably bought it at a thrift store years and years ago when my kids were little and I didn't remember where it came from. But yesterday after the children's episode, my mom texted me and she was saying how this was one of the poems that she remembers reading as a girl. She said she would ride her bike to the library, and this is one of the books that she remembers reading over and over and over again. So, anyway, I was naturally curious to learn more about the author, whose name is Eugene Field. And Eugene Field wrote these poems in this book around 1889. And then this version of the text was published in 1989, so 100 years or so after the poems were first published. When I was researching Eugene Field, I realized that he has a history connection apart from just being a 130-year-old author. His father was a lawyer who practiced in St. Louis, Missouri, and he was actually the lawyer who brought the Dred Scott case before the court for the first time.
The decision made by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case is one of the most infamous decisions in U.S. history. Dred Scott's fight for freedom lasted over a decade. His case persisted through several courts and ultimately reached the United States Supreme Court, whose decision outraged many Americans and gave momentum to the anti-slavery movement. The decision influenced the nomination of Abraham Lincoln to the Republican Party and his subsequent election, which in turn led to the South's secession from the Union and the start of the Civil War. Dred Scott was born into slavery around the year 1799 in Virginia. In 1818, he moved with his enslaver Peter Blow to Alabama. Then in 1830, he moved to St. Louis, Missouri. After Blow died in 1832, Scott was sold to Army surgeon Dr. John Emerson. As an Army officer, Emerson moved frequently, taking Scott with him to each new Army posting. In 1836, Emerson with Scott went to Fort Armstrong in the Free State of Illinois. Then in 1837, Emerson took Scott to Fort Snelling, which was then in the Free Territory of Wisconsin. Of course, now it is in Minnesota. And it was at Fort Snelling that Scott met and married Harriet Robinson. In late 1837, Emerson returned to St. Louis, but left Dred and Harriet behind and hired them out. Emerson then moved to Louisiana, which was a slave state, and in 1838, Dred Scott joined them there. In October 1838, Emerson, his wife Irene, and their slaves returned to Wisconsin. After the Army honorably discharged Emerson in 1842, he and Irene returned to St. Louis with Dred Scott and his family, which now included daughters Eliza and Lizzie. John Emerson died suddenly in 1843, and his slaves became Irene's property. She moved to her father's house in St. Louis and hired out Scott and his family. Scott tried to purchase his freedom from Irene for $300, but she refused. So Scott then sought freedom through the courts. In 1846, Dred and Harriet filed separate lawsuits for freedom in the St. Louis Circuit Court against Irene Emerson, based on two Missouri statutes. One statute allowed any person to sue for wrongful enslavement, and the other statute stated that any person taken to a free territory automatically became free and could not be re-enslaved upon returning to a slave state. And since Dred and Harriet had lived in Wisconsin and Illinois territory, they hoped that they had a persuasive case. So they filed in 1846. A year after filing, Scott went to trial in 1847, but he lost on a technicality, which was they couldn't prove that Irene was their legal enslaver. The judge granted a retrial. Then the following year, the Missouri Supreme Court decided that his case should be retried. So in 1850, the St. Louis Circuit Court ruled that Scott and his family were free. 2 years later, the Missouri Supreme Court stepped in again and reversed the decision of the lower court. So Scott and his lawyers then brought his case to a federal court, which was the United States Circuit Court in Missouri. In 1854, the Scotts filed a new suit in federal court. The defense maintained that Dred Scott was not a citizen and had no right to sue in court. The court upheld the right of Scott to sue, but the jury found that he and his family were still slaves. So at this point, the Scotts' lawyer, who was Roswell B. Field, the father of the poet Eugene Field, he appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the U.S. Supreme Court trial began on February 11th, 1856, so almost a full decade after he had first filed in the Circuit Court. The decision came on March 6, 1857. So the final majority opinion in the U.S. Supreme Court case said that all people of African descent, whether they were free or slave, were not United States citizens and therefore had no right to sue in federal court. In addition, the 7-2 decision also argued that the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which was legislation which had restricted slavery in certain territories, that it was unconstitutional. And in effect, this meant that Congress had no power to prevent the spread of slavery. This notorious decision was finally overturned by the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution after the end of the Civil War.